Kaede Akamatsu is one of the most divisive Blackens in Danganronpa v3, not because she's outright evil, but because of how the story treats her. It's a bit more complicated, because people don't necessarily hate her at first, they are more so upset at how her character came to be, and because of that, it can result into hatred. Let's go over it. On paper, Kaede is introduced with real flaws. She's stubborn, overly confident in her ability to lead, and convinced that she knows what's best for everyone else. Those flaws directly drive her decisions, including setting up a situation where someone could die. And yet, the game barely lets those flaws exist as flaws. Almost immediately, Kaede stops being treated like a messy, morally questionable protagonist and instead gets elevated into something closer to a flawless symbol of hope. Basically, it's that the game refused to let her be a gray character. Instead, they made her into a Mary Sue trope. After her death, the narrative completely reframes Kaede, not as someone who made reckless, selfish choices with deadly consequences, but as a near-perfect martyr who did nothing wrong. The story glosses over the fact that she intended to kill, that she endangered everyone else's lives, and that Tsumugi could only frame her because Kaede created the situation in the first place. Even though she didn't actually kill Rantaro, intent still matters, and the game refuses to meaningfully grapple with that. For some fans, this doesn't just hurt Kaede's character, it hurts the entire story. Shuichi's arc especially takes a hit, because the narrative's obsession with preserving Kaede's purity makes it feel like every other death matters less in comparison. Instead of letting Kaede remain a flawed person who failed, the game rewrites her into an untouchable ideal, and in doing so, strips her of the very complexity that could have made her compelling. And that's the core issue. Kaede isn't hated because she's a Blackened, she's hated because the game refuses to let her be one. Kirumi Tojo is a character many fans start off respecting, and then slowly grow irritated with as killing harmony goes on. Unlike Kaede, who's criticized for being narratively too perfect, Kirumi is often disliked for the opposite reason. She feels boring at first, and hypocritical by the end. Early on, Kirumi's biggest problem is how little there is to her. Before her trial, she's largely defined by one trait, serving others. While that fits her ultimate title, it leaves her feeling more like a tool than a person. Compared to the rest of V3's exaggerated cast, Kirumi's calm, dutiful demeanor comes off as robotic, almost like a walking checklist of perfect-made qualities. Even her free time events don't do much to help, since they focus more on how efficient she is than on who she actually is or what she feels. Then comes the motive, and for a lot of fans, this is where things completely fall apart. The reveal that Kirumi is secretly the acting Prime Minister of Japan is often seen as absurd, even by Danganronpa standards. While the series is no stranger to over-the-top twists, many players feel this one crosses the line from dramatic into nonsensical. Kirumi frames her actions as utilitarian, sacrificing a few to save millions. But fans argue that this logic conveniently centers her own survival. Her behavior during the trial only cements that frustration. Kirumi deliberately targets Ryoma Hoshi because his depression makes him vulnerable, which many fans view as especially cruel. When the case starts closing in on her, she shifts from stoic caretaker to emotional manipulator, attempting to guilt the others into sacrificing themselves for her cause. And finally, there's her execution. Kirumi's desperate sprint for freedom is meant to be tragic, but for some fans, it feels like a complete collapse of her character. Instead of going out with the quiet resolve she was known for, her end is frantic and humiliating, leaving her final impression feeling pathetic rather than sympathetic. Because Kirumi dies so early, the story never really reckons with her choices afterward. She doesn't leave behind a lasting legacy, nor does her death meaningfully shape the rest of the narrative. For many players, that makes her feel less like a tragic figure and more like a forgotten casualty, a Blackened whose impact fades almost as soon as she's gone. Korekiyo Shinguji is easily one of the most divisive characters in the series. While Kaede and Kirumi are often criticized for their narrative handling, the hatred for Korekiyo is usually far more visceral and personal. At first, Korekiyo comes across as unsettling but intriguing, a morbid anthropologist with an eerie calm and a unique worldview. That initial appeal completely collapses in Chapter 3, where the story introduces revelations that permanently redefine how players see him. The biggest breaking point for most fans is the incest reveal involving his deceased sister. This plot point is an immediate deal-breaker for a large portion of the fandom. Many players find it unnecessary, disturbing, and grossly handled, arguing that it derails Korekiyo from an interesting cultural observer into something far more one-note and repellent. What could have been a complex examination of obsession instead becomes a taboo twist that overshadows everything else about him. Unlike most Blackens, Korekiyo is also portrayed as irredeemable. He openly admits to having killed dozens of women before the events of the game, not out of desperation or fear, but because he believed he was helping his sister in the afterlife. His actions during the Chapter 3 case only deepen that hatred. After already securing a successful murder, Korekiyo kills again out of greed, simply because he wants to fulfill his ritual one more time. This second murder strips away any remaining ambiguity and cements him, in the eyes of many players, as cruel and self-serving rather than tragic. Finally, there's the issue of wasted potential. Some fans believe the sister twist exists purely for shock value, cutting short any chance for Korekiyo to develop into something more nuanced. While defenders sometimes argue that he was groomed or abused, others counter that this interpretation is never clearly supported by the text and feels more like fan rationalization than intentional storytelling. Despite being widely loved for his emotional support and passion, Kaito Momota is also one of the most polarizing characters in Danganronpa v3. One common criticism is his stubbornness, particularly in Chapter 4, where he refuses to accept the evidence against Gonta even after a confession. For some players, this comes across as reckless, since his refusal to engage with reality could have resulted in everyone's execution. Others point to Kaito's outdated views on masculinity. His frequent use of phrases like "man up," along with comments suggesting certain actions don't suit women, have made some fans uncomfortable. In the original Japanese script, there are also moments where his language toward more feminine or queer-coded characters, such as Korekiyo, reads as dismissive or derogatory. Gonta Gokuhara is generally considered one of 𝙎𝙤𝙘𝙞𝙖𝙡's most beloved characters, but that doesn't mean he's immune to criticism. While most fans see him as a tragic, gentle figure, there's a smaller but vocal group that finds him frustrating, not because he's malicious, but because of how the game and fandom handle him. One of the most common complaints is Gonta's infantilization. Both the narrative and the community frequently frame him as an innocent cinnamon roll, which some fans find shallow and annoying. People argue that this framing acts as a shield, preventing meaningful criticism of his actions. Despite committing murder and actively attempting to deceive his classmates, Gonta is often excused or 𝙎𝙚𝙙𝙬𝙀 to the point where he loses complexity and humanity. Chapter 4 is where moral criticism really emerges. Some fans argue that Gonta lacks agency and is reduced to a pawn in someone else's plan, making his role feel passive and underwritten. Others push back on that interpretation, pointing out that he ultimately makes his own choice, deciding that ending everyone's lives is a form of mercy. Tsumugi Shirogane is one of the most disliked characters in the entire Danganronpa franchise, frequently ranking near the bottom of popularity polls. While some fans praise her as an effective hidden-in-plain-sight villain, the overwhelming hatred toward her comes from one core issue: she is intentionally uninteresting, and many players resent having to spend a 40-hour game alongside a character designed to be dull. Before Chapter 6, Tsumugi's defining trait is being aggressively plain. This is, in theory, meant to support the mastermind twist, but in practice, it leaves her feeling flat and irrelevant for most of the game. Her constant self-labeling as plain quickly becomes repetitive, and for many players, irritating. People argue that being boring on purpose doesn't make a character clever, it just makes them boring to sit through. When the mastermind reveal finally happens, a lot of fans felt nothing. Unlike previous twists, Tsumugi's betrayal lacks emotional impact because she never meaningfully bonds with the rest of the cast. Outside of a brief connection to Kaede, she mostly exists on the sidelines. As a result, her reveal doesn't sting, it just confirms suspicions. Ironically, her total lack of character development made her one of the most obvious suspects, causing what should have been a massive shock to feel predictable instead.